Comment number one is a spoken word poem written and performed by Gil Scott Heron. In this 1970 poem, Heron heavily criticises the predominantly white student movement and its claim to represent radical change. I chose this poem to focus my oral presentation on as, although I do agree with most of what he is saying, and love the passion and raw emotion behind both the lyrics and voice, some ideas I feel are very extreme and sometimes unwarranted, as throughout he groups all people who are unaffected by a problem but decide to help anyway as being dishonest and unable to understand the true struggle, as ultimately, whatever outcome, they will be unaffected. This is the main idea in the poem I disagree with. He shuns the idea that there could be a worthwhile and meaningful alliance between the white new left, such as the Students for a Democratic Society or the SDS, and the radical organisations of colour. Heron believes this is the mainly white, privileged, middle and upper class who could afford to go to college are incapable of understanding the poor and disadvantaged. I was greatly affected by this poem, as while it was written over 40 years ago, there are still many similarities and parallels to this time regarding such themes as revolutionary fads and injustice towards the underprivileged. Heron throws these themes, such as us, through the use of such techniques as emotive language, symbolism, metaphors. His tone also speaks to the overall feeling of the poem, which is highly critical as well as having an overwhelming feeling of determination and righteousness. His voice is also accompanied by the sound of bongos, which is mainly freestyled and adds to the emphasis and punch of the poem. One of the main themes in this poem that affected me was the theme of revolutionary fads, which Heron is using to say that many people, in this case the SDS, who sympathise with the group's case or with the plight of the underprivileged are not actually invested in the movement, but are instead just following the trend as they think they are helping, but really they cannot understand the injustice and pain of the poor man, as either way they will go home with a clear conscience and a college degree, and ultimately will be unaffected. This statement or theme affects me as there are many truths to this, such as, for example, the Ebola outbreak, which occurred in 2014. Western civilization was distraught with the idea that this heinous virus could possibly invade our shores from Western Africa, where it had wreaked havoc for the past 2 decades. This helped shine the light on the virus in West Africa, where in 2014, according to the Time magazine, over $1 billion had been funded and raised to help battle the Ebola crisis in West Africa. But as soon as the threat of an Ebola outbreak in the first world country was mostly ruled out, the media stopped covering the devastation in Africa caused by Ebola, government stopped funding, and people stopped donating, as ultimately we were unaffected by the Ebola virus, while Western Africa is still very much in a crisis. While I do agree with the fact that after a while the majority of the population stop or forget to keep caring, there are still many volunteers from Western countries that would not have been affected by the Ebola virus that have gone and tried to help care for the Ebola-ridden patients in areas in West Africa, and I believe this also stands true for civil rights movements in the Americas in the 1970s. An example of this is Sue Siona, who has no different than other white American in this time, but still chose to be a Freedom Summer activist in 1964, which she continued to help until 1969 to help bring to the fruition the newly acquired African American right to vote. Whereas many white college students were fighting with the blacks for legalised smoke or lower voting age, less lit from their generation gap, which are trivial to the wants of Heron as his peers, such as a good home and a wife and children and some food to feed them each night. I believe, just like in West Africa in modern times, that there are still many people that were unaffected otherwise that decided to help or protest like Sue Siona. Not for trivial things such as legalised smoke, but because they really did sympathise and saw something wrong with the way the blacks and the underprivileged were being treated in 1970s America. In this poem, Heron's viewpoint reminds me of the Greek philosopher Dionysus, who would often wander the streets of Athens with a torch. When asked why, would answer, "I am searching for an honest man," as he believed that all man's actions are not honest but instead are always for one's self-gain, which was exactly Heron's view on the white college protesters and activist groups. The only truth that can be delivered to a 4-year revolutionary with a whole card, i.e. skin, is this: mess up what you can in the name of Peggy Wallace, Dickless Nixon, Spiro Agnew, leave Brother Cleaver and Brother Malcolm alone, please. End quote. I believe the overall reason for Heron to think this way and to mainly class a privilege in one category, which is dishonest and selfish, is because he had not, at least at this time of his life, been able to see the good nature of humans, no matter what class, which I cannot blame him for, as for centuries the blacks were oppressed by the upper class through dehumanizing ways such as slavery, segregation, police brutality, and was seen as less than human by the majority of whites up until the mid-20th century. Heron goes into the way that underprivileged had been treated over the centuries and uses symbolism to delve into the history of African Americans in America and how the American government tries to cover up and forget these inhumane, distorted acts. Start quote. America stripped for bed, and we had not all yet closed our eyes. The signs of truth were tattooed across our often-entered vagina. We learned to our amazement untold tales of scandal, 2 long centuries buried in a musty vault, hosed down daily with a gagging perfume. End quote. America stripping for bed symbolises America going to sleep and closing its eyes to the wrong it has done, trying to forget, while we had not yet closed our eyes symbolises the African Americans not being able to forget, as in some ways they still face the same struggles as they did 2 centuries ago. The next line is also saying this. How could they forget when they are reminded each day by the misfortune they face both now and in the past? We learn to our amazement each day the misfortune they face both now and in the past. We learn to our amazement untold tales of scandal, 2 long centuries buried in a musty vault. This is America trying to hide its dirty secrets, much like a scandal, which is then made to look good as America tries to get rid of the odour of wrongdoings and hoses itself down daily with gagging perfume. While listening to the poem, I became infuriated, as I cannot begin to imagine how frustrating it is for African Americans, as about centuries they have been oppressed, yet so quickly they are asked to forgive the government and the people when their great-grandfathers tied a chain and ball to my balls and bounced me through a cotton field. End quote. And where the current president wants to make America great again, but America was only ever great for the middle and upper class, while African Americans, minorities and underprivileged were made to suffer in silence. Comment number 1, performed and written by Gil Scott Heron, addresses the hardships and underprivileged in America have faced both in the current. When this poem was written in 1970 and in the past, it addresses that America tries to cover up its wrongdoings and forget while the underprivileged cannot. It attacks the SDS as the author believes that their actions are not honest and that they cannot understand the plight of the underprivileged, as they have never been underprivileged and as they cannot afford to go to college. I agree with what that they might not be able to understand the struggles underprivileged face because they are not underprivileged, but I disagree that the actions are not honest. For example, the Springbok tour of New Zealand protests in 1981, as while the protesters were never affected by apartheid agenda in South Africa, they recognised that it was wrong, and the New Zealand government and rugby union approved the Springboks to tour New Zealand, as they saw it as NZ also approving the apartheid agenda in South Africa. They recognised that it was wrong when the New Zealand government and rugby union approved the Springbok tour to New Zealand, as they saw it as New Zealand also approving the apartheid agenda. So they chose to protest the tour, and were in turn protesting apartheid. And when they were able to put the Hamilton game to stop on the 25th of July, Nelson Mandela was reported by the NZ Herald as saying, start quote, "When the prisoners on Robben Island had heard protests had forced the Waikato Springbok game off, it was like the sun came out," end quote. Although the New Zealand protesters did not understand the struggle of being coloured in South Africa during apartheid, the actions still influenced and gave hope to those who were being oppressed by apartheid. While the poem's tone was mainly negative and violent, it also made me very grateful to live in this era. In this country, where to the younger generation, race is no longer a factor, except for a small minority, and where someone isn't judged or oppressed because of skin colour, but only judged on what's on the inside. I am unbelievably grateful that I'm able to have friends of colour and am introduced to so many different cultures, as no doubt I'd be a much different person if I was confined to the bubble of only being able to interact with other Caucasian people and culture. Hopefully in the future there will no longer be black people, white people, Asian people, but only one classification, people.